The fire crackled low in the hearth at 221B Baker Street, casting flickering shadows upon the walls. I had just set down my pen, weary from the day's events, when Holmes, who had been silent for the better part of an hour, suddenly extended a hand. In it, he held a letter. The paper was creased, the ink smudged as if gripped by trembling fingers. "Watson, we have been summoned to Blackwood Manor," he said. "A matter of life and death, or so Lord Blackwood believes." I took the letter from him and read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, I beg of you, come at once. A great curse plagues my family. My father, my uncle, and now my youngest brother have fallen to its grasp. Their bodies, lifeless, their faces, frozen in expressions of the most dreadful terror. I fear I'm next. Please, for the love of reason, help me before the curse claims us all." My stomach tightened. The words were fevered, desperate. The Blackwood name carried weight, an old aristocratic family, known for their vast, decaying estate on the outskirts of Dartmoor. Holmes leaned back, tapping his fingers together. "Curses, Watson," he murmured, "are nothing but a convenient veil for very human wickedness. And I intend to pull it aside." Outside, the wind howled against the window panes. Within the hour, we were preparing for departure. As the cab rattled through the misty streets of London toward Paddington Station, Holmes sat in deep contemplation, the letter still in his grasp. I could see his mind working behind his sharp, calculating eyes. "Tell me, Watson, what do you deduce from Lord Blackwood's letter?" I considered. "It is the writing of a man in great distress. The mention of a curse suggests hysteria. He believes he is doomed." Holmes nodded. "Indeed. But there is something more interesting in what is omitted. No mention of how the victims were found, save for their expressions. No account of any marks upon the body, no sign of struggle, and yet he fears he is next. Perhaps the deaths occurred under similar circumstances, lending credence to the idea of a pattern," I suggested. "Or perhaps," Holmes mused, "he knows more than he dares put into words." I frowned. "You suspect deception?" "I suspect fear," he corrected. "And fear, Watson, is the most powerful tool in a murderer's arsenal. It can cloud reason, it can control men, and in some cases, it can kill." The train whistled as we pulled into the station. Holmes tucked the letter into his coat and stepped onto the platform. "Come, Watson, the game is afoot." The journey to Dartmoor was long and shrouded in fog. The train's whistle was lost in the vast open moors, where skeletal trees clawed at the sky. The deeper we travelled, the more I felt an unnatural weight pressing upon my chest, a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the cold. As the carriage rattled along the desolate road to Blackwood Manor, our driver, a grim-faced man with hollow eyes, muttered darkly, "You gentlemen best watch yourselves. The Blackwood curse don't take kindly to strangers." I stiffened at his words, but Holmes merely raised an eyebrow. "Curses are rarely selective, my good man. But tell me, how many have died under its hand?" The driver glanced at him warily. "3 so far, all found dead in their beds, as if the devil himself reached into their souls." Holmes made no reply. Instead, he peered through the misted window as the looming silhouette of Blackwood Manor came into view. A towering, decayed fortress, its spires piercing the stormy sky. The iron gates groaned open as we approached. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," I murmured, suppressing a shiver. Lord Blackwood awaited us at the threshold, a haggard shell of a man despite his youth. His once noble features were drawn, his eyes sunken and haunted. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he breathed, gripping my hand with icy fingers. "Thank God you came." His voice was hoarse, as though sleepless nights had wrung the life from him. As he led us inside, the air grew thick with dust and despair. Candlelight flickered against peeling wallpaper, casting twisting shadows upon the walls. "3 dead," Lord Blackwood whispered. "First my father, then my uncle, and last night, my youngest brother Thomas." I followed his gaze to the grand staircase, where a large portrait loomed, a grim-faced patriarch in a high-collared coat, his eyes following us wherever we moved. "My family is cursed," he muttered. Each victim found the same way, lifeless, their faces contorted in terror. No wounds, no sign of intrusion, just dead. Holmes studied him. "Tell me, Lord Blackwood, do you believe in this curse?" Lord Blackwood swallowed hard. I don't know what to believe anymore." My gaze fell upon the wall beside the staircase. There, etched into the stone, were ominous words. "The sins of the father shall visit the son." Thunder rumbled overhead. Holmes turned sharply. "Show me where he died." Lord Blackwood hesitated, but then, with slow, reluctant steps, he led us deeper into the shadows. The hallway was lined with dust-covered portraits of long-deceased Blackwood ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow us with silent judgment. As we moved deeper into the manor, our footsteps echoing against the cold stone floor, my attention was drawn to the far wall, its surface cracked with age, the faded wallpaper peeling away to reveal something hidden beneath. "Holmes," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped forward, his sharp gaze locking onto the inscription now visible beneath the decayed plaster. The words, etched in deep, deliberate strokes, sent a chill through me. "The sins of the father shall visit the son." Holmes ran his fingers over the letters, his expression unreadable. "Curious," he murmured. "Old, but not as old as this house. This was written with purpose, Watson. Someone wanted it to be seen. Perhaps as a warning or a threat." "But by whom?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back, observing the inscription from a different angle, his keen mind already at work. "We shall find out soon enough," he said at last, his voice cold with certainty. The air in the manor was thick with unease. Shadows stretched unnaturally long under the dim candlelight, and the whisper of the wind outside might have been mistaken for the murmurs of the dead. The servants, their faces tight with fear, gathered hesitantly as Holmes questioned them. One by one, they recounted the same dreadful tale, a faceless spectre seen lurking in the halls before each death. A figure clad in shadow, its presence a silent harbinger of doom. "The curse," one of the maids whispered, clutching a frayed rosary. "It has haunted this house for centuries, Mr. Holmes. Those who see the figure do not live to tell the tale." Holmes regarded her with measured calm. "And yet, you speak of it now." She swallowed, averting her gaze. "Because I have not seen it myself. But my sister, she served the late master before his death. She swore she saw something standing at the foot of his bed that night. He was found dead the next morning." "And where is your sister now?" Holmes asked. The maid hesitated. "Gone, sir. She fled the manor the very night Lord Thomas died. She feared she would be next." I glanced at Holmes. He said nothing, but his fingers tapped idly against his chin, a sure sign that something in the maid's words had piqued his interest. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass as though something sought entry. The fire in our chamber burned low, casting dancing shadows along the walls. Despite the warmth of the hearth, a deep, bone-deep chill lingered in the air. Holmes sat in his chair, his long fingers steepled, his expression unreadable as he considered the evening's revelations. "A faceless spectre, Watson," he mused at last, breaking the silence. "A curious legend, but legends do not kill. Men, however, do." "You are certain this is no supernatural affair?" I asked. The atmosphere of the house had done much to unnerve me, though I would never admit it. "I am certain of very little," Holmes admitted. "But I know this. Fear is the most potent weapon in existence. If one believes they are doomed, they often make it so." I shivered, though not from the cold. The night stretched on in uneasy silence. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock upon the mantel. But then, just as my eyelids began to grow heavy, a scream tore through the stillness, a piercing, wretched sound, the cry of someone who had seen the very face of death. I was on my feet before my mind could fully comprehend what had happened. The scream had come from the far end of the hall, its roar choked terror enough to make my blood run cold. Holmes had already thrown open the door, striding into the corridor with the singular focus of a bloodhound on the scent. I followed, my pulse pounding in my ears. We reached the door to one of the guest chambers. Lord Blackwood stood outside, his face ashen, his hands trembling violently. "It's happened again," he rasped. Holmes wasted no time. He pushed past him and entered the room. A body lay upon the bed, a young footman, no older than 20, his face twisted in an expression of unspeakable horror. His hands were clawed at his throat, as though he had tried, in vain, to fend off some unseen assailant. Holmes bent over him, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the scene. He exhaled slowly. "Now, Watson, the game truly begins." A cry, shrill, raw with terror, split the silence of the manor like the crack of a gunshot. My eyes flew open. For a moment, I was unsure if it had been real or the lingering grasp of some dreadful dream. But then I heard it again, an anguished, desperate wail echoing through the vast, hollow halls of Blackwood Manor. Holmes was already on his feet, slipping on his coat with a practiced efficiency. "Come, Watson," he said, his voice composed, but with an unmistakable urgency beneath it. "It appears the curse has claimed another." We moved swiftly, the floorboards groaning beneath our hurried steps. The air was thick with something indefinable, a palpable sense of dread, an unseen force pressing upon us. The cry had come from the west wing. As we rounded the corridor, Lord Blackwood stood in the doorway of one of the chambers, his face deathly pale, his body trembling violently. "It's Thomas," he whispered, barely able to force the words past his lips. He's dead." Holmes strode past him without hesitation, stepping into the chamber. I followed, bracing myself for what lay beyond. The flickering candlelight revealed a body lying upon the bed, Lord Blackwood's younger brother, his eyes wide open, his lips parted in a frozen scream. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. Thomas Blackwood lay sprawled upon his bed, his hands clawed at the sheets, his entire body rigid as if gripped by some unseen terror in his final moments. But it was his face that sent a chill creeping down my spine. His features were contorted into an expression of pure, unrelenting horror, the kind that does not come from pain alone, but from the absolute certainty of something unspeakable standing before you. I turned to Holmes, who had already begun his examination. He ran a careful hand over the body, then leaned in, his sharp gaze flickering with interest. "No signs of struggle, no external wounds," he murmured. Yet his body is stiff, his mouth agape, as though he had seen something that turned his very soul to stone. Lord Blackwood stood in the doorway, his breath shallow, his eyes wet with panic. "The curse," he whispered. "First my father, then my uncle, and now my brother. It's real, Mr. Holmes. It's real." Holmes did not look up. Instead, he traced a gloved finger along the victim's lips, his expression unreadable. "Real," he echoed softly. "Perhaps. But curses do not leave behind evidence, Lord Blackwood. And yet," he paused, his gaze narrowing, "this one has." The household was in an uproar. Servants huddled together, murmuring darkly, their fearful glances darting toward the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. Some refused to even speak, their trembling hands clutching crucifixes as though afraid to utter the words aloud would summon the spectre itself. One elderly maid, her face drawn and pale, finally found her voice. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you it would come again. The curse does not rest. It does not forget. We are all doomed. A footman crossed himself, his voice barely above a breath. My grandfather worked here when I was a boy. He said he saw it once, the faceless one, a shadow standing over the bed of the last master before he died. Holmes, standing among them, remained still, his gaze unreadable, detached even, as if listening to a conversation of no real consequence. A faceless spectre, he repeated flatly. Fascinating. Tell me, did anyone see it tonight? The silence that followed was answer enough. Holmes exhaled slowly. Then we must set aside ghosts and begin looking for something far more dangerous. A man who wishes to be mistaken for one. Holmes knelt beside the body, his keen eyes scanning every inch of the victim, with a precision that spoke of years of experience. The dim candlelight caught the faint sheen of his magnifying glass as he ran it over Thomas Blackwood's still features. A moment later, he stilled. His gaze sharpened. "Watson," he murmured, tilting the young man's chin. "Observe the skin just below the mouth." I leaned in. At first I saw nothing, but then, under the light, I caught the faintest impression, a tiny, almost imperceptible puncture upon the skin, no larger than the tip of a needle. "A pinprick," I breathed. But what could it mean? Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he lifted his head, his nostrils flaring slightly. "Do you smell that?" he asked. I inhaled, detecting only the stale air of the manor and the lingering scent of candle wax. But then, something faint, something acrid, barely there, yet unmistakable. "Yes," I admitted. "What is it?" Holmes rose to his feet, his gaze fixed upon the body with growing intrigue. "A question, Watson, one that may lead us to our answer. But first, we must see if our killer has left us any more traces of his work." And with that, he strode toward the window, his mind already 3 steps ahead. The manor, once merely oppressive, now seemed to breathe with something far darker, an air of expectation, of unseen eyes lingering in the corners of every corridor. The servants huddled together like frightened children, whispered among themselves. "It walks the halls at night," one muttered, barely audible. "A shadow where no shadow should be," another said, voice trembling. Each time, before a death, Holmes, standing at the edge of the gathering, regarded them with a cool detachment. "Describe it," he commanded. A young maid, no more than 17, clutched at her apron. "It moves like mist, sir. At first, just a trick of the candlelight, but then you see it standing there." "Watching," another added, shuddering. I glanced at Holmes. He remained impassive, but I knew that beneath his composed exterior, his mind was already dissecting each word. "Shadows do not kill," he murmured. "But fear, once planted, is a most efficient executioner." His gaze swept the room, sharp as a blade. "Fear is being cultivated here, Watson," he murmured. "The question is, by whom?" The servants fell silent as an elderly maid stepped forward, her hands wringing the frayed edges of her shawl. She was pale, her face lined not just with age, but with fear long endured. "I saw him," she whispered. Holmes turned to her, interest flickering behind his eyes. "Saw whom?" She swallowed hard. "A man, a figure, cloaked, standing by the trees, just beyond the gate, watching the house." A hush fell over the room. "When?" Holmes pressed. "An hour before young Thomas was found," she said. "I was in the kitchen. I happened to look through the window and there he was, just standing there, still as death. And then—" Her voice faltered. "Then he was gone." Holmes studied her, his expression unreadable. "Why did you not mention this before?" The old woman's hands twisted tighter in her shawl. "I was afraid. No good comes from speaking of things that should be left alone." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Then, almost as an afterthought, he murmured, "And yet, here you are, speaking." She shivered, but said no more. Holmes turned away, his voice barely above a whisper. Then we are not dealing with a ghost, Watson. We are dealing with a man who very much wishes to be mistaken for one. The household eventually settled into uneasy silence. Lord Blackwood, drained and shaken, had retired to his chambers. The servants murmured their prayers. Holmes, however, had not rested. By the dim glow of the candlelight, I found him once again at the bedside of the dead man, his lean figure bent over the still form. His hands moved with methodical precision, examining every inch of the body. "You have found something," I murmured. "I have confirmed something," he corrected, his voice almost distracted. I stepped closer. Holmes had drawn a thin instrument from his pocket and was running it gently along the victim's lips, his gaze sharp as he studied the surface. A moment later, he withdrew a fine piece of blotting paper and held it up to the light. A faint discoloration spread along the edges, so faint that I would never have noticed it without his keen demonstration. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes regarded it for a long moment before answering. "A trace, Watson. A trace of something that should not be here." He pocketed the paper and straightened, his gaze distant. "As I suspected. But why?" I watched him, uneasy. Holmes rarely spoke to himself unless his mind was circling something deeply troubling. "Holmes," I pressed, "what does it mean?" He did not answer. Instead, he turned toward the door, his voice eerily calm. "Tomorrow, Watson, we will set a trap, and if my suspicions are correct, the ghost of Blackwood Manor will walk straight into it." The hush that had settled over Blackwood Manor was the kind that preceded storms, not of weather, but of revelation. The air was thick with the weight of whispered fears, the servants' murmuring of things unseen, and the lingering unease from the night before. But Holmes, ever the pragmatist, stood apart from it all, a solitary figure in a house drowning in superstition. "You do not believe it, then?" I asked, watching him as he stood by the rain-lashed window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Believe in what, Watson? That a restless spectre roams these halls, striking the Blackwood men dead in their beds?" He turned, the sharp glint in his eyes betraying amusement. "Number. There is no ghost here, only a human mind, carefully orchestrating terror. And yet the bodies show no wounds, no marks of violence." Holmes's voice was calm. "Fear, my dear Watson, is a far deadlier weapon than a blade. I do not deal in curses, I deal in facts, and facts tell me that someone in this house benefits greatly from these deaths." A sound from the corridor interrupted him. The door creaked, and Lady Eleanor stood there, pale as moonlight, her eyes wide with something perilously close to horror. "Mr. Holmes," she breathed, "you must come at once." She led us to the grand sitting room, her hands trembling as she lit a lamp, its golden glow casting uneasy shadows upon the walls. She did not sit, nor did she meet our eyes. Instead, she stared into the darkness beyond the window, where the moor stretched like a vast, unknowable abyss. "It has begun again," she murmured. Holmes folded his arms. "What has begun, Lady Eleanor?" A figure stood behind me. I saw it, a shadowy form, just beyond my shoulder, unmoving, watching. A chill laced through me. My muscles tensed, but when I spun around, there was nothing there. Holmes had seen my reaction. His gaze flickered toward the mirror, sharp and calculating. He stepped forward, examining it with the intensity of a man studying an intricate puzzle. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Tell me, Watson, what precisely did you see?" "A man," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended, standing behind me. But when I turned, he was gone. Holmes finished for me. He reached out, running a gloved hand over the mirror's surface. "Then let us determine whether this phantom exists in glass alone, or in the flesh." Holmes wasted no time. His mind was already assembling the puzzle, and he required answers. He turned on his heel, striding through the halls with a purpose that I struggled to match. "Holmes, where are we going?" I asked breathlessly. "To the only man who may shed light on this riddle," he replied. The door to Lord Blackwood's study loomed before us. Holmes did not knock. He pushed it open with swift determination, stepping inside before the master of the house could protest. Lord Blackwood sat at his desk, a half-empty glass of brandy in his trembling hand. His face was ashen, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Holmes?" he demanded, his voice weak but laced with frustration. Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze unrelenting. "What is it that you are not telling me, Lord Blackwood?" The man stiffened. For a fraction of a second, his expression faltered. Fear, fleeting but present. "I have told you everything," he said. Holmes's voice was quieter now, but no less commanding. "No, my lord, you have told me everything you wish me to believe. Now, I require the truth." Lord Blackwood gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. "And if I do not tell you?" Holmes leaned in, his voice no more than a whisper. "Then I shall find it myself." Holmes stood over the lifeless body of Thomas Blackwood, his keen eyes tracing every detail, his mind working faster than I could comprehend. The room was thick with the stench of unease, the very walls seeming to press in on us, holding secrets within their ancient stones. "We are dealing with no spectre, Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice measured. "This is not the work of a supernatural entity, nor the vengeance of the damned. This," he gestured at the stiffened corpse, "is murder. Cold, calculated murder." I shuddered. "But how, Holmes?" "There are no signs of struggle, no indications of violence." "Precisely. Which means the weapon is not one of brute force, but of something far more insidious. Something that kills in silence, leaving behind nothing but terror." I studied the expression of the dead man. His lips parted in a scream that never came, his hands frozen in mid-clutch, as if trying to ward off some unseen horror. "Fear," Holmes murmured. "Fear is the murder weapon, but fear alone cannot stop a heart." He crouched beside the body once more, his sharp gaze narrowing. Then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, he added, "Unless, of course, it has help." Holmes retrieved his magnifying glass and leaned closer to the corpse, his focus absolute. The dim candlelight flickered against the sharp angles of his face as he traced the skin near the victim's lips with a gloved finger. "There," he murmured, almost to himself. "Barely visible, but undeniable." I stepped forward. "What is it?" He tilted the young man's head slightly, revealing a minute puncture just below the corner of the mouth, so small that one could mistake it for a blemish. "A pinprick," I breathed. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Almost imperceptible, but present on each victim." "Then something was administered before death." "It would appear so." Holmes straightened, his expression dark with thought. "A substance, one that induces paralysis, perhaps hallucination, something that would grip the victim in a state of mortal terror, rendering them helpless." "But why their faces?" I asked. "Why always that dreadful expression?" Holmes exhaled, his fingers steepled in contemplation. "Because, Watson," he said slowly, "they saw their death before it came. They saw something so utterly horrifying that their minds succumbed before their bodies could." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "But what, Holmes? What did they see?" Holmes turned toward the door, his voice low and certain. "That, Watson, is what we must now discover." Holmes paced the length of the chamber, his thoughts unraveling before him like threads on a loom. The storm outside lashed against the windows, but within these walls a far more insidious tempest brewed. "Fear, Watson," he said, more to himself than to me. "It is the most primal of all human emotions. It can paralyze, it can consume, and in the right hands, it can kill." I swallowed, watching him intently. "But fear alone is not enough," he continued. "One cannot simply whisper ghost stories and expect a man to die of fright. No, the fear must be real, utterly, inescapably real. The body must believe it is doomed. I thought back to the whispering in the halls, the tales of shadows that walked before death. You believe it was induced? I asked. Induced, cultivated, and carefully orchestrated, Holmes confirmed. This murderer is not simply killing, he is performing. Performing. Holmes turned to me, his gaze alight with grim certainty. This is not just a crime of passion, nor one of convenience. It is psychological warfare. The victims did not merely die, Watson. They were made to die, by their own minds, by the sheer weight of terror. I felt an unease settle in my chest. And if he succeeds once more? I asked. Holmes's jaw tightened. Then we shall ensure that he does not. The fire in the drawing room had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Holmes sat in an armchair, his long fingers pressed together in thought. Across from him, Lord Blackwood sat stiffly, his face drawn, his hands trembling against his knee. You intend to leave? Blackwood asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes did not look up. Yes, Watson and I shall depart before dawn. A flicker of something, relief, crossed the man's face. Then you believe it is beyond your power. Holmes exhaled slowly, studying the dying embers. No, Lord Blackwood. I believe the danger is very much here, and that you are next. Blackwood's breath hitched. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze unreadable. If we leave, the killer will strike again. He believes himself unseen, untouchable. But fear has a curious way of loosening tongues, does it not? He stood, pulling his coat around him. Fear will drive him to act, Watson. He will move against Lord Blackwood, believing his path clear. And when he does, his eyes gleamed coldly, we shall be waiting. I inhaled sharply. You mean to set a trap? Holmes smiled faintly, the expression of a man who had already won a game, yet to be played. Not a trap, Watson. A performance. And I expect our villain to play his part beautifully. The hour was late. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes as if something sought entry. Within the manor, all seemed still, but I knew better. Holmes had ensured that the night would unfold precisely as he intended. Lady Eleanor's chambers lay at the far end of the west wing, her door bolted, the air inside heavy with silence. Yet even as she lay in bed, her breathing was unsteady, as though some unseen force was tightening around her throat. From the shadows, Holmes and I watched. He had stationed us in the hidden alcove just beyond her door, listening, waiting. Then, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, a rustling beyond the threshold, like the movement of fabric against wood, a presence. I turned to Holmes. His gaze was unwavering, his posture poised. He is here, he whispered. Inside the chamber, Lady Eleanor let out a soft, troubled moan. Her breaths came faster, a whisper of distress in the oppressive dark. Holmes's fingers tightened into a fist. Now, Watson, he murmured, we watch a murderer at work. The door to Lady Eleanor's chamber creaked open by the barest fraction. A hooded figure, cloaked in the very shadows themselves, slipped inside like a wraith. The intruder moved with purpose, silence, precision. In his hand, he held a small vial, its glass glinting faintly in the dim candlelight. I strained to see what Holmes had already discerned. The figure approached the bedside, unscrewing the vial's cap with a measured care that spoke of experience. Then, he released the contents into the air. A near-invisible mist unfurled, coiling through the chamber with the slow, insidious grace of a living thing. It spread toward Lady Eleanor, who stirred slightly, her breath hitching, her hands twitching against the covers. Holmes moved. With the swiftness of a striking cobra, he threw open the door, the force of it slamming against the wall. Enough! His voice, sharp and commanding, sliced through the silence. The hooded figure spun around, momentarily stunned, but Holmes was upon him in an instant, his grip ironclad as he wrenched him away from the bed. The figure struggled, but Holmes held fast. "You see, Watson?" he said, voice cool despite the struggle. "Even phantoms can be caught." With one swift motion, he pulled back the hood. A gasp left my lips before I could contain it. Lord Blackwood. His face, contorted with exertion, was drenched in sweat. No longer the tormented victim of a curse, but the orchestrator of it. Lady Eleanor, coughing weakly, gazed upon him with uncomprehending horror. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not you." Blackwood fought still, his breath ragged, his muscles straining against Holmes's hold. But my companion was relentless. "A clever deception," Holmes said, tightening his grip. "The Blackwood curse, a tale woven so intricately that even you believed it in the end. But no spirit took your family, my lord. That honor belongs solely to you." Blackwood's struggles ceased. A terrible silence fell. Then, a laugh. Low, bitter, broken. His shoulders slumped. The fight had drained from him. "Holmes," he murmured, "you see so much, and yet you do not see everything." Holmes's expression did not change. "Then tell me, Lord Blackwood, what is it that I do not see?" Blackwood's eyes burned with something beyond madness, something raw, desperate. "You don't understand," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no choice." Holmes remained unmoved. "Murder is not choice, Lord Blackwood. It is intent, and yours was most deliberate." Blackwood let out a hollow breath. "You think I wanted this," he whispered. "You think I wished to be the last Blackwood standing. No, Mr. Holmes, I did not kill my family out of greed. I did it because if I did not—" He shuddered, his entire body racked with the weight of something unseen. "The curse would have taken me next." Silence. A long, endless silence. Even I, a man of science, felt the air grow heavy with something unexplainable. Holmes studied him, his piercing gaze devoid of sympathy. "A curse did not claim your family, Lord Blackwood," he said coldly. "You did." Then at last, Holmes released him, and Lord Blackwood, broken and empty, sank to his knees. Lord Blackwood collapsed into the chair, his trembling hands gripping its arms as though they alone tethered him to reality. His face, once the portrait of aristocratic dignity, was now drawn and ghostly pale. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. The weight of his crimes, the horror of his own doing, had finally settled upon him. Lady Eleanor stood frozen near the doorway, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if the man before her was no longer her brother but some stranger wearing his face. Holmes remained unmoved. He stood before the fallen nobleman, his gaze as sharp as a scalpel, dissecting him, peeling back the layers of madness and desperation. "The mind is a curious thing, Lord Blackwood," he said, his voice cool and precise, "capable of creating its own demons and of destroying itself in turn." Blackwood swallowed hard, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Only a shuddering breath, a whisper of something broken beyond repair. "You never believed in the curse," Holmes continued, "and yet, in the end, you feared it more than anyone." Blackwood shut his eyes, his fingers digging into the chair's fabric. "It was real," he rasped. "It had to be." Holmes turned away from Blackwood and began to pace, his long fingers pressed together, his mind assembling the final pieces of the puzzle. "You built an empire of fear," he said, his tone almost thoughtful. "A grand illusion, carefully crafted, layer upon layer, until even you could no longer see where the deception ended and the truth began." He halted, fixing Blackwood with a piercing stare. "You chose fear as your weapon because it requires no blade, no gun, no physical force at all. It is the perfect killer, and you, my lord, are a master of its art." Lady Eleanor gave a sharp intake of breath. "But how?" she whispered. "How did he make them die of fear?" Holmes exhaled slowly, then gestured toward the small vial that had been wrested from Blackwood's grasp during his attempted murder of Lady Eleanor. A rare hallucinogenic gas, he explained, nearly undetectable in its natural state, save for the faintest scent, one which, I suspect, you did not even notice as it crept into your lungs. It induces vivid and horrifying visions, drawing upon the deepest recesses of the victim's mind, their worst nightmares, made real. He turned back to Blackwood, his voice a low murmur. And the beauty of it, from your perspective, was that they killed themselves. Their own terror became the executioner. A mind convinced it is dying will make it so. Blackwood flinched as though struck. You see, Watson, Holmes continued, his voice sharper now. He did not summon ghosts. He merely allowed his victims to see their own. The room was silent save for the crackling of the dying fire. Outside, the storm raged, the wind pressing against the manor's ancient walls like the whispers of restless spirits. I swallowed hard, the enormity of Holmes's words settling upon me like a lead weight. Then the victims. They believed they saw the curse. Not merely believed, Watson, Holmes corrected. They knew it. Their minds, twisted by the gas, conjured horrors so real that their very bodies succumbed. Their hearts stopped. Their lungs failed. The Blackwood curse did not kill them. He turned to Blackwood, his expression unreadable. You did. Blackwood let out a strangled sound, something between a laugh and a sob. He shook his head, his fingers clenching against his temple. I did not kill them, he whispered. I merely let the curse take them. Holmes's voice hardened. A curse you designed, a curse that ensured no one stood between you and the inheritance of this estate, the last remaining Blackwood fortune. Lady Eleanor let out a small cry, her hands flying to her mouth. Dear God, she breathed. Was it always about money? Blackwood's hollow eyes met hers. No, he whispered. Holmes folded his arms. Then tell us, Lord Blackwood, what was it about? Blackwood exhaled shakily. Survival. Why? The word escaped me before I could temper my voice. Why, in God's name, would you do this? Lord Blackwood remained slumped in the chair, his fingers twitching against the fabric, as though grasping for something unseen. Holmes, however, stood unshaken. His keen gaze swept over the man, stripping away pretense and weakness, leaving only the truth. Because he had no other choice, Holmes said. Lady Eleanor's breath hitched. No choice, she whispered. Holmes exhaled softly, his voice calm, yet precise as a blade. The Blackwood estate is in ruin. Your family's wealth has been a facade for years, its debts mounting, the fortune dwindling. Your father hid it well, but after his passing, the truth could not be concealed forever. And so, Lord Blackwood did what desperate men do. I stared at Holmes, realization dawning. He ensured he would inherit it all. Holmes nodded. One by one, the obstacles fell. First your father, then your uncle, then your brother. All conveniently removed, all seemingly victims of a centuries-old curse. And with each death, your grip on the estate tightened. Did it not, Lord Blackwood? Blackwood let out a shuddering breath but said nothing. And yet, Holmes continued, the greatest irony is that your plan was never truly necessary. Your family's wealth may have been dwindling, but you would not have been left destitute. It was not poverty you feared. Holmes leaned in. It was irrelevance. Blackwood's lips parted, but no words came. Holmes turned toward Lady Eleanor. Tell me, my lady, how long has the legend of the Blackwood curse been whispered in these halls? She hesitated. Since I was a child, she admitted. Long before any of this. Holmes nodded. That is how a lie becomes truth, Lady Eleanor. It is spoken, repeated, woven into history until even the teller forgets its origins. Your brother did not create the legend, he merely wielded it. I frowned. But how did he know it would work? Holmes's voice darkened. Because he understood the most primal human weakness, fear. He knew that once the idea of death took root in his victims' minds, their own bodies would betray them. I swallowed, recalling the frozen, horrified expressions on the faces of the dead. Each of them believed, Holmes continued. They saw their own doom in the dark corners of this house, and so their minds did the rest. Fear gripped their hearts, their bodies succumbed, and Blackwood became the last man standing. Lady Eleanor shook her head, as if she could shake away the horror of it all. "And yet," she murmured, "you cannot explain what I saw, Holmes. My reflection, it moved." Holmes regarded her for a long moment. Then at last, he spoke. "No, Lady Eleanor," he said quietly. "You only think it did." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the halls. Heavy, deliberate. The constables had arrived. Lord Blackwood did not resist as they took him by the arms, his body limp, his face empty. His fight was over. But then he laughed. Low at first, but rising, filling the cavernous halls of Blackwood Manor like the whisper of the dead. "You think you've saved me, Holmes," he rasped, his lips curling into something that was not quite a smile. "You think you've outwitted the curse?" Holmes watched him with silent calculation. Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with something far worse than madness. Certainty. "It is real," he whispered. "You'll see." Then, without another word, he allowed himself to be led away, his laughter fading into the storm. I turned to Holmes, unsettled by the lingering echoes. "Surely you do not believe—" "No, Watson," Holmes cut in smoothly. "I do not believe in curses." But as we stood in that great hollow house, the wind pressing against the windows, a single mirror in the hall cracked, spontaneously, without reason. Holmes's gaze flickered toward it, just for a moment. Then, with a quiet strike of a match, he lit his pipe, and said nothing at all. The carriage wheels churned through the muddy roads, the glow of Blackwood Manor fading behind us. The storm had passed, yet the air remained thick, oppressive. Holmes sat opposite me, his features composed, his sharp gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the window. Lord Blackwood had been taken into custody, the final remnants of his scheme laid bare for all to see. "And so, the Blackwood curse is no more," I murmured, as if saying it aloud would make it so. Holmes did not immediately respond. His fingers drummed idly against his knee. His mind, I knew, still unravelling the lingering threads of the case. "A curse is nothing more than a story, Watson," he said at last. "A fabrication passed down through generations, gaining weight only through the willingness of men to believe in it." I exhaled, nodding. "Then the matter is truly settled." Holmes did not answer. Instead, his gaze flickered toward the window once more. At that moment, a figure appeared on the road behind us, a lone silhouette, standing perfectly still in the moonlight. I turned, heart lurching, but by the time I blinked, it was gone. A trick of the shadows, I told myself. And yet, a quiet unease curled within me, refusing to be ignored. As we rode, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that something remained unresolved. Not in the facts of the case. Holmes had exposed every deception, every falsehood, and yet, fear killed them, I said suddenly. Holmes did not glance at me, but I knew he was listening. Not the gas, not Blackwood's manipulation, at least not entirely. It was fear itself, Holmes, the sheer belief that death was coming for them. They died without a single hand upon them. Holmes exhaled softly. "Indeed, Watson, fear is the most potent of poisons." I shook my head. But how? How does a man's own mind betray him so completely? Holmes steepled his fingers. "Consider the stories we tell ourselves, Watson, the myths we inherit, the shadows we allow to creep into our consciousness. A man convinced of his own doom has already succumbed to it." I shuddered. Then the Blackwood curse was never real. Holmes finally met my gaze. His expression was unreadable. "Perhaps not, Watson," he said, "but the deaths were. Outside, The landscape blurred past, darkened fields stretching endlessly beneath the weight of an unquiet night. We arrived at our lodgings in the early hours of the morning. The city was silent, still, the gas lamps casting long shadows against the wet cobblestone streets. Holmes, as was his custom, removed his coat with precise movements and settled into his chair by the fireplace, his expression giving no indication of fatigue. "There is something still troubling you, Holmes," I observed, pouring us each a measure of brandy. He accepted his glass but did not drink. Instead, he regarded me with a calm intensity. "I have long held the belief, Watson, that every mystery has an answer, every illusion, a mechanism behind it. The world does not abide the supernatural. It merely invites the willing to see what they expect to see." "And yet?" I pressed. Holmes hesitated. A rare thing. "And yet," he admitted at last, "for the first time, I find myself asking, what if?" The room fell silent. Holmes was not a man given to superstition. And yet, I had seen it, the brief flicker of doubt in his otherwise unshakable gaze. I set down my glass, my throat dry. "Do you believe in the curse, Holmes?" A long pause. Then, Holmes lit his pipe, exhaled a slow stream of smoke, and said nothing at all. 2 days later, we returned to Blackwood Manor. It was empty now, silent. Yet the house had not lost its weight. It still loomed, its halls still holding on to the whispers of the past. Holmes moved with measured steps, his gaze sweeping the corridors, as if expecting to find some final clue left undiscovered. "Does it feel different to you?" I asked. Holmes paused before the great hall mirror, the same mirror where Lady Eleanor had claimed to see something unnatural. "No," he said simply. "It feels precisely the same." I swallowed. "And yet that is precisely what unsettles me." Holmes studied his own reflection, his face impassive. Then, without a word, he drew his gloved hand across the glass. The surface did not shatter. It did not shift. It simply remained. Holmes turned from it, stepping toward the door. "Come, Watson, there is nothing more to be found here." But as I turned to follow him, I saw something, a single, thin crack forming along the surface of the mirror. I opened my mouth to speak, to call Holmes back. But I did not. Because some things, I decided then, were better left unknown. We were halfway down the corridor when the sound split the silence. A sharp, splintering crack. Holmes halted, his head snapping toward the disturbance. A mirror in the hallway had fractured, a jagged fissure running through its once pristine surface. I felt a chill creep along my spine. "The glass," I murmured. "It just—" Holmes stepped forward, his movements measured, his gaze fixed upon his own fractured reflection. "An accident," he muttered, though there was no conviction in his tone. He ran a gloved hand along the edge of the mirror, careful not to disturb the shards. His own face stared back at him, distorted by the break, a reflection no longer quite his own. Lady Eleanor, who had remained silent until now, let out a soft gasp. "It was my father's mirror," she whispered. "He always said it held the truth of the Blackwood curse, that when the time came, the glass would break on its own." Holmes turned to her, his sharp gaze unreadable. "Superstitions often have a way of fulfilling themselves, my lady," he said. But even as he spoke, his fingers hesitated against the mirror's edge. The house was empty now, its ghosts unmasked, its horrors explained. And yet, the air felt heavier than before. Holmes took a step back, his face still half captured within the broken glass. And for a moment, just a moment, he did not move. Holmes remained still, his reflection frozen in place, though he himself had stepped away. I opened my mouth to speak, then stopped, the words catching in my throat. The logical part of my mind insisted it was an illusion, a trick of the broken glass. But logic had not shielded the Blackwood victims from their fate. Holmes finally shifted. The reflection followed a fraction of a second too late. It was imperceptible, almost laughable in its subtlety, but I had seen it. "Holmes," I said slowly, "do you still think there was no curse?" The words hung between us, weighted with something unspoken. Holmes did not answer immediately. His expression did not change, nor did his keen eyes waver from the shattered mirror. For years, I had witnessed his mind dismantle the impossible. Yet, in this moment, he hesitated. At last he turned to me, his gaze shadowed, unreadable. "You are a man of science, Watson," he murmured. "What do you think?" I could offer no answer, and Holmes did not press me for one. Holmes reached into his coat, retrieving his pipe with steady hands. The soft scratch of a match striking broke the silence, its flame flickering against the fractured mirror. He did not look at me. He did not look at the mirror. Instead, he lit the pipe, inhaling slowly before exhaling a thin stream of smoke into the cold air. "A trick of the light," he murmured at last, though he did not sound convinced. I wanted to push further, to demand an answer. But as I watched him standing there, his gaze fixed not on the glass, but through it, I understood that there would be none. Some things, I realized, were never meant to be explained. The great Sherlock Holmes, a man of reason, had solved the case, but reason itself had left something behind. A shadow, a question, a crack in the glass that should not have been there. Holmes exhaled another slow breath, his face half veiled in the curling smoke. And in the reflection of the broken mirror, for just the briefest of moments, his image did not move.